Thank you all for coming. This series is on. Series this year is on the emotions and the passions. So I thought I'd talk about that in connection with some historical dimensions, but particularly focusing on religious belief. So has everyone got one of these handouts, which is just the quotations, really? If not, there's someone. Has everyone got one? Anyone not got one, I should say, really? Some at the back. If you look at the first quotation, A, this is actually a comment of Sherlock Holmes in the Conan Doyle stories, which kind of sums up, I thought, the antithesis between reason and the emotions. And he says, whatever is emotional is opposed to that cold, true reason which I place above all things. And actually, that, I think, sums up what quite a large number of philosophers would say about reason versus the emotions. The prejudice against the emotions goes back a long way in philosophy, in fact, right back to Plato, who stressed the need for them to be held in check by controlling reason. The famous image in the Phaedrus, as you know, is of the chariot with reason in the driving seat, the charioteer, and the two horses. The dark one represents the appetites, the base appetites, and there's a lighter horse representing the spirited element. And that image has been variously interpreted. Some see it as looking forward to the Stoic idea of the complete suppression of the emotions, whereas others see it as a more harmonious vision in which emotions and reason are all involved, but under the controlling guidance of reason. But I think it's fair to say that the prevailing impression in many of Plato's works, perhaps the Republic is the best example, is of the best life being the life of philosophical reason, operating on a pure rational plane as far as possible, free from the distortions arising from the murky world of the senses and the emotions. Everyone hear me okay? Do say if anything is not audible or clear. And from Plato onwards, we find, I think, many examples of what you could call a ratiocentric tendency in philosophy, a tendency to give primacy to a certain kind of abstract and detached reasoning in our understanding of the world. So if you look at quotation B from Bertrand Russell, he talks about the free intellect which will see as God might see, without hopes and fears, calmly, dispassionately, and will value more abstract and universal knowledge into which the accidents of private history don't enter. I'm not sure how many people would think of Russell as a model for philosophy now. He's not that much studied. But nonetheless, I think the attitude is increasingly common in the contemporary philosophical scene. Not everywhere, but it's common. If you look at the typical article in one of today's leading philosophy journals, I think you'll find you can't fail really to be struck by its very dry, austere tone. As if the author's trying to take a judiciously detached stance, evaluating the evidence, treating philosophical inquiry as very much an impersonal and impartial enterprise. The style in philosophy journals is increasingly becoming more and more like that in science journals. And here it's no accident that a great many analytic philosophers are strongly influenced, I think, by the so-called Naturalistic Revolution in philosophy. As Brian Leiter has dubbed it, this is C on the sheet, where philosophy sees it as its role to adopt and emulate the methods of the natural sciences, or to operate in tandem with them as its abstract and reflective branch. Despite this approach, the influence of the scientific method and the exacting methodology of contemporary philosophy, minute dissection of arguments and so on, it's striking, and a lot of people have commented on this, that we're not actually one whit nearer agreement on many of the key issues on which philosophers have been so divided for hundreds of years. It's extremely rare to find a philosopher walking out of a seminar saying, oh, I've actually changed my mind. I used to be a determinist, but now I'm a libertarian, or I used to be a materialist, but now I'm a dualist, because that argument convinced me. What they much more like to say is, oh, that was an interesting argument, but I think about it, meaning I'm going to find some counter-arguments, or I'm going to find some flaws in the argument. So actually, Alistair McIntyre, I think, in a recent book called Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, puts it quite well, where he says, I think this is on the sheet too, yes, this is D, I've worked my way slowly and painfully. The pain is often the pain of boredom, he says. Through the literature and philosophy of mind and ethics, he's talking about, nothing in it's given me reason to abandon or modify the views here or the arguments I've expressed. And he, I think, goes on to put his finger on why that should be when he says, my aim in my writing is not to secure agreement of my readers, since whether or not I do so depends in large part on the convictions and the assumptions they bring with them. I think that's right, and there's something important there that I think philosophers need to be much more aware of. Of course, arguments can be flawed, and it's extremely valuable to uncover the flaws by minute dissection. But once the flaws have been ironed out, then your attitude is going to hinge, attitude to an argument, is going to hinge, I think, very largely on where it starts from, depend on underlying assumptions and presuppositions which typically operate below the level of detached rational analysis. I think that's one reason why examples are so telling in philosophy. Often analytic philosophers treat them in rather sort of, oh, this is just an illustration, you don't go into the detail. But actually, it's often the argument that tips the scales as far as, you can go through endless PowerPoint slides showing premises and sub-premises, and the response will only be sort of puzzled frowns or skeptical yawns. But sometimes a particular example will suddenly clear the mist, and people will think, I can now see where that person's coming from philosophically and why that argument resonates or doesn't resonate with me. As Wittgenstein saw, what often underlies a philosophical position is a certain picture, a certain underlying picture of reality. And as I'm sure you know this famous quotation, pictures can often hold us captive. They can kind of have a hold on us perhaps at a pre-rational level. It's not just a matter of knowledge or rational analysis, it's a matter of, it's something much more complex. And I think when we're dealing with the big philosophical questions about the nature of reality and our place within it, then, and how we should live our lives, the picture has to be one that comes alive for you, one you can with integrity live with and accept as making sense of who you are and how you relate to the world. So in my recent work, I've been arguing for what I call a more humane, for a humane turn in philosophy, in contradistinction to the scientific or scientistic turn. This doesn't in any way reject the values of analytic philosophy, the commitment to clarity and rigor and so on. I mean, I was trained in that tradition, greatly value those aspects of it. But the point is really more that we need additional resources. We need to deploy in philosophy, we need to deploy all the resources of the human mind, including imaginative and emotional and empathetic modes of awareness. This seems to me a point we ignore at our peril if we want to achieve true philosophical understanding. And that's especially relevant to branches of philosophy like moral philosophy and I think philosophy of religion, which I'll come on to in a moment. I think it was at least 2 decades ago when Bernard Williams, I think, first suggested there might be something about moral philosophy which meant that the tools of analytic reasoning are not wholly suited to dealing with it, or not suited to solve all its problems. And I think the point applies even more to philosophy of religion. Because I think it's clear that the adoption or rejection of a theistic or other religious outlook is not nearly as dependent on purely intellectual assessments and arguments as is often implicitly presupposed by philosophers and philosophers of religion. It's not necessarily a matter of wanting the subject to be more continental as opposed to analytic. I think that old distinction has long been exposed as much too blunt an instrument. The problem is more about what Eleanor Stump has called, this is E, the cognitive hemianopia of analytic philosophy. Its tendency to suppose that left brain skills alone will reveal to us all that's philosophically interesting about the world. I mean, hemianopia is only thinking with one hemisphere of the brain. I mean, that distinction, let me just make it clear, I just take it as a useful shorthand. I mean, it's not the case that the 2 hemispheres of the brain are discrete systems that use different completely different systems. They're constantly interacting. But I think most people now have a kind of intuitive understanding of what people mean by left brain versus right brain. Left brain are the detached analytic skills. I mean, if you don't like this label, you can choose something else. The right brain are the more empathetic, holistic, involved modes of awareness. And I think it's clear that human beings have both these ways of being in the world and reacting to the world. So Eleanor Stump's criticism, she was speaking here just 2 weeks ago, though she didn't get onto this topic. The criticism is that much philosophy of religion is curiously detached from the imaginative and emotional modes of awareness that we actually find in religious texts and the religious life generally. And I think taking more account of that would help to rescue the subject from the rather dreary dead end where I think a lot of it's got stuck. As you know, there's an amazing amount of debate now on philosophy of religion. The subject's really taken off. But a lot of it is a sort of standoff between militant atheists on the one hand and kind of professional theologians and philosophers of religion on the other. And there's very little meeting of minds. There may be the sparks may fly, but there's very little, I think, that even begins to engage the other side or seriously move them towards thinking about, shifting their position. The only effect of the fireworks is to make people devise ever more ingenious counter-arguments, the same phenomenon I was referring to a moment ago. I think philosophy obviously is an intellectually demanding subject, but it isn't or shouldn't be just a clever intellectual game. The object should be to deepen our understanding of the reality we inhabit. And to do that, I think we need to engage our imagination and our emotional equipment, thinking you can achieve understanding in intellectual abstraction from the phenomena we're supposed to be studying would be rather like thinking you could, for example, you would expect a true understanding of music to arise simply by scrutinizing and debating the theories of musicologists without any actual contact with musical sounds and musical emotions. You know, the crucial phenomena that we're thinking of when we say that's a very musical person. We don't mean they can pass musicology exams. Though, you know, that may be, I'll mention that a bit more later. So let me come on. There's just 4 sections to this paper, as indicated in italics at the top of the sheet. So what is, I come on to section 2, what is the role of the emotions in our grasp of the world we inhabit? Well, there's been quite a bit of work on this in recent years, as many of you will know. Michael Stocker has argued that emotional states, such as anger or pity, have a vital role in directing our attention, focusing our attention, thus radically affecting the way we perceive things. He says they they seek out and collect concordant facts, which they then use to justify and sustain the emotion, which leads in turn to further seeking and collecting. Similarly, Mark Wynne, very distinguished philosopher of religion, has argued that the emotions have a role in guiding inquiry by constituting patterns of salience. But the role, I think, isn't merely a heuristic one. It's not just that the emotions are helpful in helping us to look in certain directions, but rather, if, as Peter Goldie has suggested, this is F, coming to think of the world in a new way is not to be understood as consisting of thinking of it in the old way plus some added-on phenomenal ingredient, a feeling perhaps, or rather the whole way of experiencing or being conscious of the world is new. The difference between thinking of X as Y without feeling and thinking of it with feeling won't just comprise a different attitude towards the same content. The difference also lies in the content, though it might be this difference can't be captured in words. I think the idea here is that emotion doesn't just function as a kind of extraneous add-on, you know, like the salt added to the popcorn, which leaves the structure of the popcorn unchanged. It's perhaps more like the yeast added to the flour, which radically changes the properties of the resulting bread. I mean, it's just an analogy, and you could raise questions, as with all analogies, but it's useful, I think, in helping us to challenge or maybe deconstruct this very sharp dichotomy between reason and the emotions, as if the former were just a matter of pure objective, relating to pure objective content, while the latter, the emotions, are just our own subjective reaction, a sort of endogenous reaction. I think that there may be whole areas of life where we're cognitively blind to the relevant content if our emotions aren't operating as they should. So I think it's worth thinking about the fact there may be whole areas of reality, aspects of reality, that just can't be discerned via the cold, rational tools of analysis, intellectual analysis. As I was saying about the musical example, there may be beauty and power of a given piece of music which just can't be captured or discerned even via the techniques of musicological analysis. I mean, the theoretical analysis does serve a purpose in mapping certain features out, but those are certain abstract or formal structures which are of course important and essential to the identity of the composition, but which don't disclose its power or beauty. To see why, you have to imagine that case of someone who's a musicological expert, passed all the relevant exams, but can identify all the formal patterns, and yet who, for example, might be tone deaf, and so utterly lacking in the kind of musical understanding that's so important to see the role music plays in our lives. And that involves certain kind of feeling and emotional responsiveness. Let me consider another example, the ability to perceive the beauties of nature. The colour and variety of an alpine meadow in springtime, if you want an example, or the grandeur and splendour of the fells in the Lake District. This brings me on to Wordsworth, who makes it William Wordsworth, the poet, who makes it abundantly clear, brilliantly clear, that the kind of awareness involved in the perception of these properties is in large part an emotional awareness. Those who look at the scene with cold, clinical eye may perhaps see other things, but the beauties may just pass them by. This, I think, is what he might have meant by these lines in G. Nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy, for she can so inform the mind that is within us, and then it goes on for many lines which I won't remember, I mean the purport of which, that no subsequent distress or disappointment or pain of later life has the power to shake our cheerful faith that all that we behold is full of blessings. So she can so inform the mind. The informing, the delivery of the right kind of awareness enables us to see the truth of what is there. And this requires a certain kind of emotional sensibility, a loving openness to the reality spread out before us. A loving openness. I think that's the point about nature never did betray the heart that loved her. A final example, consider the dynamics of a close personal relationship, a loving personal relationship, where the qualities that draw two people together in mutual involvement, I think, are not such as can be appreciated by the detached spectator or the coldly impartial observer. As Gregory the Great observed in the 6th century, amor ipse notitia est. Love itself is a form of knowledge. And I think part of what that means is that love is not simply a non-cognitive impulse of feeling that happens to arise in one person when they make contact with another. I mean, perhaps there are certain kinds of attraction or arousal that are like that. But when there is genuine love and commitment, those involved have a certain kind of intimate knowledge of each other. They are aware of more dimensions, deeper dimensions of the other person's nature than could be accessed if no loving emotion were present. The couple's understanding of each other, to borrow a phrase from the 12th century Benedictine William of Thierry, becomes an understanding of enlightened love. Enlightened love. So that's the sort of general schema. Let me now move on to section 3 and the particular case of Descartes. From these general observations on the rich cognitive role of the emotions, in our understanding of reality, in the domains of music, beauties of the natural world, personal relationships, those three cases. So let me turn now more specifically to religious understanding, if you think there is such a thing. I mean, some people might say, oh, there's no such thing as religious understanding. In fact, there was a famous letter written by Richard Dawkins to the Times quite a while ago now, calling for the resignation of the then Regius Professor of Theology at Oxford on the grounds that there shouldn't be such a chair since there was no subject called theology, presumably meaning that theology studies God, but since there's no God, there's no such subject. So to avoid begging any questions of that kind, let's agree for present purposes to put the issue of God's existence or otherwise on one side. I don't think anything in this talk directly presupposes that. What is undisputed is that many of the great canonical philosophers in Western philosophy have been religious believers. And so it's of some interest to know what role they considered the emotions as having in that religious allegiance. René Descartes, placed God at the center of his philosophical system. It's not an aspect, perhaps, that's very much, well, it's sometimes glossed over nowadays. But his approach to God is normally considered purely intellectual. He's typically classified as the rationalist philosopher, a leading figure in the Age of Reason, to use the title of a famous textbook by Stuart Hampshire. It's been around for many, many years now. The label rationalist suggests to philosophers perhaps the aspiration to build a philosophical system a priori, using the pure light of reason without reliance on the fluctuating and unreliable data from the senses, let alone the murky and confused influence of the emotions. Well, it's quite true Descartes does start the Meditations, his philosophical masterpiece, with arguments designed to lead the mind away from the senses, a tradition going back to Plato and Augustine. But those brought up on a very rationalistic view of Descartes may be surprised to find that the text of the Meditations uses quite dramatic and emotionally involved language at key stages of the argument. So, for example, the hyperbolical, the exaggerated doubts of the first meditation, where Descartes conjures up nightmare scenarios of not being able to tell whether he's awake or asleep, demons, malicious demons, mad, the possibility that he might be mad, questioning even his own ability to reason coherently from moment to moment at the most extreme, ends up at the close of the meditation with an expression of fear, the fear of being cut off from the light and having to struggle amidst, quote, inextricable darkness. The term for darkness in the original text, Latin text, is tenebrae, which resonates with religious significance in the culture in which Descartes was raised and which he was writing. The ancient tenebrae liturgy for Holy Week commemorates the darkness that fell over the land in the gospel stories of the death of Christ. And the darkness is eventually dispersed by the light on Easter morning. So it's quite the connotations of the image in the 17th century would have been, I think, consciously or quite strongly, at least at a subconscious level, religious ones. And the darkness of ignorance in the Meditations will eventually be dispelled by what Descartes calls the immense light that appears at the end of the third meditation. when the meditator finally finds his or her way out of the darkness by establishing the existence of God, the source of light and truth, Descartes expresses this in very emotive language. This is H on the sheet. Here I should like to pause. It's the first one on the second page or turnover page. Here I should like to pause and spend time in contemplation of God and gaze at, wonder at, and adore the beauty of this immense light insofar as the eye of my darkened intellect can bear it. These verbs in the original Latin, gaze at, wonder at, adore, intuere, admirare, adorare, kind of almost like a litany, really. And the faculties involved are not just intellectual. Notice in particular wonder. Wonder is one of the passions, the emotions, discussed by Descartes in his last published work, The Passions of the Soul. And God is the light of reason, the source of that light, but he emerges at the end of the meditation not as the guarantor of the truths of science, that's going to come later, but rather as the fountain of truth and goodness, the immense light towards which the finite creature, the meditator, must reach, not just in a spirit of cold clinical inquiry, but as that quotation makes clear, in a spirit of awe and wonder. The light is not fully perceived, but glimpsed only insofar as the eye of my darkened intellect can bear it. And Descartes immediately goes on to talk about the joy that arouses, voluptas in Latin. So there's another passion making an explicit appearance. Now, if you draw attention, I mean, very few analytic lectures on Descartes would even mention those passages. They would just bracket them off, I think. But if you draw people's attention to them, you might get the response, oh, well, that's just a bit of rhetoric, nothing to do with the argument. But I think that would be a mistake. For what actually happens in the meditation, in effect, is an encounter of the finite mind with the infinite. This has been well described by Hilary Putnam, following Levinas, actually, Emmanuel Levinas. This is J, not so much a step in deductive reasoning as a profound religious experience. An experience might be described as the experience of a fissure, a confrontation with something that disrupts all the categories of the meditator. On this reading, Descartes not so much proving something as acknowledging something, acknowledging a reality he couldn't have constructed, a reality, this is the infinite, the reality of the infinite, which proves its existence by the very fact that its presence in my mind turns out to be a phenomenological impossibility. Bit of a mouthful, but I think what's going on here is actually discussed by Descartes when he was later asked by some critics in what are called the objections to the Meditations, which were published with the Meditations in 1641. And discussing the matter, he says that when we attend to the infinite perfections of God, we should not so much try to understand them as to surrender to them. A very graphic phrase in the original Latin, non tam capere quam capi, not so much to grasp as to be grasped by them. Because, as Descartes frequently says, following Aquinas and others, the finite mind cannot grasp the infinite reality that is God, but it can in a way be grasped by it. So here we've got surrender, humility, submission, awe, wonder, these notions are not really modes of rational analysis, but are modes of awareness in which the emotions are inextricably involved. But that's not, as it were, just a rhetorical add-on. It's, I think, part of the philosophy. It's part of what may grab you about this part of the meditations, or may possibly repel you, depending on your prior assumptions. But it's a crucial part of what's going on. So let me come on to section 4, the emotions and the intellect in synergy. So I think these are sort of underappreciated aspects of Descartes' philosophy, but in drawing attention to them, I'm not at all trying to downplay the importance of rational analysis, careful intellectual analysis. In fact, in the same passage, that non tam capere quam capi passage, not grasp as be grasped, Descartes also speaks of using all the strength of the intellect to contemplate the perfections of God. So it's not a case, I think, of either the intellect or the passions, but rather of a philosophical journey in which both play an important role. The synergy of the intellect and the emotions, I think we can see in Descartes' near contemporary, Blaise Pascal, whose approach to religion is often thought of as a very emotional one, at the other end of the spectrum from the supposedly rationalistic or rational Descartes. A very well-known description Pascal gives of his conversion experience, his so-called Night of Fire, the Nuit de Feu, in 1654, where he speaks of tears of joy at having found God. Not, he says famously, the God of the philosophers, but the God of a living tradition of faith. And one of his best-known sayings is K1 on the sheet, c'est le cœur qui sent Dieu et non la raison. It's the heart that senses God, not reason. But actually, he's not saying the reason isn't involved at all, because in another passage he says, and this is K2, nous connaissons la vérité non seulement par la raison, mais encore par le cœur. We know the truth not just by reason, but also by the heart. So he doesn't rule out of the possibility that the two could work in synergy. That connects up with the thesis I've argued for elsewhere, namely that I think we need a new epistemology for thinking about religion, religious belief, and its basis. Many modern contemporary critics of religion, including most of the new atheists, seem to operate with what you could call an epistemology of control. And actually, interestingly, that's also true of many defenders of religion, many philosophical and theological defenders. That's to say, the idea is that we should scrutinize the evidence from a detached standpoint. We should, if you like, in a left brain kind of way, and decide then, come to a conclusion about the existence or otherwise of God. I think there's several reasons to doubt the validity of such a strategy. I mean, it's reasonable enough perhaps to think that if the theistic view is correct, then there should be evidence for its truth. Certainly if you take a believer's stance, a theistic stance, then a loving God would presumably want his creatures to be, God's creatures to be aware, have some awareness of him. But it doesn't follow that such awareness should be achievable via intellectual analysis, formal arguments, or scrutiny of evidence. On the contrary, classical theism has always maintained, as to say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, for example, that God is a hidden God, the Deus absconditus, at least partly hidden, a God who's less interested in proving his, if you excuse me using the word his for as a shorthand, existence, or demonstrating his power, than being interested in the moral and spiritual development of his creatures, and in deepening the understanding of those who seek him with all their heart, as Pascal said. So why expect the evidence for God's existence to be spectator evidence? A rather nice phrase used by the American philosopher of religion, Paul Moser, whom some of you may know. Spectator evidence, kind of evidence you can scrutinize and assess irrespective of the attitude or moral stance of the inquirer. Sort of thing you can scrutinize from a distance, as it were, or from a detached basis. Instead of this epistemology of detachment or control, staying in control, we may need something more like an epistemology of involvement or receptivity, one that posits truths accessible only to those who are suitably receptive. Now you may think, oh, that makes it a bit easy for the defender of religious belief. Can only get the evidence if you're already halfway. But as I perhaps already suggested, I think this is a feature, whether we like it or not, that's true of many aspects of reality. After all, there are many areas of life, appreciation of poetry, music, the other one I mentioned, entering into a personal relationship, where in order to achieve proper knowledge and awareness, we need to some extent to give ground. We need to be open, porous, to use a phrase of Martha Nussbaum in a famous article called Love's Knowledge. So we need to be not hard, detached, critical evaluators, but open, porous, receptive listeners. So by always priding ourselves, as so many philosophers do, in being in control, on insisting on spectator evidence that we can inspect from a distance, we may be hardening ourselves against the very possibility of our being able to perceive the truth or the reality in question. So maybe it's worth thinking about that philosophers ought to be more holistic, if I can put it like that, in their approach when assessing a given set of claims. In other words, they should take more account of the way the emotions and the intellect can work in synergy. Doesn't mean that our philosophizing about religion should be sort of wild and woolly, or that we should downplay the importance of evidence. It's not a matter of just sort of blind faith. I'm not arguing for that position. The point rather is one, I think, related to what William Wainwright has said. This is L on the sheet, that mature religious belief can and perhaps should be based on evidence, but the evidence can be accurately assessed only by men and women who possess the proper moral and spiritual qualifications. We might add to that qualifications are not just a purely cerebral matter, but must involve a deepening of our sensibilities and emotions. Wittgenstein pointed out famously that understanding the meaning of a sentence can't work atomistically, just in isolation, but requires you to enter into the form of life, the complex context of which a given proposition is a part. So rather than assuming, as much philosophy of religion, and much philosophy generally, I think, has done, that we can assess the cognitive content of a claim in isolation from the practice, the life world that gives it meaning, that brings it alive. There may be good reason to start at the other end, as it were, and look at what people do. In the religious case, look at praxis, religious liturgy, praxis, rituals, religious activities, before we presume to extract the supposed propositional core, the doxastic or belief ingredients, and pronounce from a distance on their truth or falsity or their acceptability. So if we do start looking at religious practice as opposed to abstract doctrine, the role of the emotions, I think, comes even more clearly into focus. So William Wainwright, who I mentioned a moment ago, has talked about what he calls the ingestion, the sort of devouring, the digesting of religious texts. Following up a point made by Paul Griffiths a bit earlier, this is M, that in many traditions, especially religious traditions, especially before the invention of printing, there was repeated reciting, chanting, memorizing, and reflecting, and that had the effect of making the text enter, this is the quotation, into the fabric of one's intellectual and emotional life in a way that makes deep claims upon that life. The result of such spiritual formation is not just a subjective matter, private feelings, but a profound difference in emotional, a profound shift in emotional outlook that makes a big difference to the way we see the world. So let me now quickly move on to the final section and just talk about some caveats and conclusions. The standard terms I've been using, reason, the emotions, are rather crude labels, and perhaps suggest that there are two discrete compartments in the mind. I think that bears little relation to how our minds actually work. The modes of awareness we often group under the level emotion are, in some cases, better described as imaginative modes of awareness, ways in which we reach out and come to terms with the complexity and wonder of the world we inhabit. Wordsworth called imagination reason in its most exalted mood, and it clearly plays a role in human culture, just as much a role as scientific reasoning does. Indeed, it may play a role in scientific reasoning too. One of the chief vehicles for the imagination is myth, which is an inescapable part of human culture. One thinks not just of archetypal stories about our origins, like the myth, the stories in Genesis, for example, but a whole range of human symbolic activity. Graham Ward, a theologian, in a recent book called Unbelievable, Why We Believe and Why We Don't, has called these the symbolic realms that we hominids have been cultivating for the last 2 million or more years. So these are interlocking modes of human culture, including, for example, poetry, art, ritual. They tap the powers of the imagination and operate in a way that's not always clear to our conscious rational scrutiny. Such work, this is Ward, I don't think it's on the sheet, intimates that our experience of being in the world is freighted with a significance that only the mythic can index. So the maps drawn, I think his thought is the maps drawn by the analytic intellect are very far from capturing the whole truth. Poetry, myth, symbol, story can express truths and insights that can't adequately be captured in other ways. And they do so by just precisely by tapping into these emotional and imaginative modes of awareness. But, now this is the caveat, clearly the emotions and the intellect can lead us astray. I mean, perhaps a notorious case is Martin Heidegger, who was so captivated by the myths of ancient German purity and courage as to lead him into the arms of the Nazis. And on a more mundane, everyday level, we all know that passions can cloud the judgment and lead us astray. In fact, Descartes himself said a lot about this. One of his remarks is N on the sheet. Often passions make us believe certain things to be much better and more desirable than they are. Then, when we've taken much trouble to acquire them, and in the process lost the chance of possessing other more genuine goods, possession of them brings home to us their defects, and then arise dissatisfaction, regret, and remorse. A very familiar story in human life. And he goes on to say that the true function of reason is to examine without passion the true value of the goods that are before us, in the hope that we can rank them in proper order. Well, without passion, as I hope has sort of begun to emerge during this talk, that's, I think, a forlorn hope, the idea that we can prescind completely and abstract from the emotions. Philosophers who claim to speak with the pure voice of reason are certainly not immune to the influence of what lies beneath. In fact, when they think they're being most dispassionate, they're perhaps most apt to be lacking in self-awareness. Go back to the case I began with, one of the quotations at the beginning, that of Bertrand Russell, the apostle of reason, a philosopher of undoubted intellectual brilliance. But he notoriously once argued for embarking on a preventive nuclear war against Soviet Russia if they continued their aggressive policies. His calm, rational assessment of the facts had led him to that conclusion, perhaps hardly the best endorsement for philosophical rationality. I think whether a given argument carries conviction for you, as I said earlier on, depends on the presumptions, the assumptions you bring with it. And you don't have to go all the way with Freud to accept, I think, one of his key insights, really, that the mind is not this transparent goldfish bowl in which there swim these clearly visible things called beliefs and desires, things you always hear philosophers talk about as if we just had to identify them and then all is well. I know all philosophers don't speak like this, but a surprising number do, I think. So when reason is linked to arrogance and lack of self-awareness, it can clearly lead to very dangerous conclusions. So it's not only the emotions that can lead us astray. Reason, I think, just doesn't operate in this timeless, noumenal realm. It's always, to a greater extent, the product of the complex contingencies of human life that shape all of our outlooks. We can try to achieve a balanced view. Clearly we should. But nothing in philosophy, I think, can be self-certifying. There's no hotline to the truth. But what I think I've been arguing today is that if we try to truncate the imaginative and the passional part of ourselves, all we achieve is a colourless picture of reality that can lead us astray just as much as the wilder fancies of imaginative fancy. So where does this, in conclusion, leave religion? Well, philosophers have had very contrasting views. As you know, some have said, like Kierkegaard, that faith arises out of infinite passion. 50,000 out to sea, 50,000 fathoms deep. Sorry, I've misquoted. 70,000 fathoms of water. So it's a purely passionate. Faith is pure. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people like Thomas Aquinas, Richard Swinburne, perhaps very differently, of course, in our own day, who rely on what's supposed to be purely abstract, rational, or in Swinburne's case, probabilistic arguments that are supposed to carry conviction for any detached, rational observer. I don't have space here to discuss either of those extremes, but let just me end by saying that I don't know anyone who's been converted or deconverted by pure rational arguments or evidence. Conversely, I don't know many believers who'd be happy about the sort of extreme Kierkegaardian position of saying my conviction is based purely on passionate faith. There's an interesting example which I'll leave you with in Tolstoy's famous novel Anna Karenina, not the transgressive couple Anna and Vronsky, but the other character, Konstantin Levin, who are the main character. And what happens in the novel towards the end is a radical shift in his hitherto skeptical attitude to religion, detached attitude. The shift comes about as a result of an emotional crisis he faces in his life, which is the risk of his wife, Kitty, dying in her first pregnancy. And Tolstoy describes, at the time written, a very real danger, of course, in many, many pregnancies. And Tolstoy describes how he feels as his wife goes into labor, and he's confronted with the very real danger that poses to her life. And his perceptions, it's a very interesting passage, kind of shift. He sees for the first time her true integrity, her true beauty, and simultaneously his heart is kind of opened to the mystery and fragility and wonder and terror of life and love. And he begins, as described in the novel, he begins to pray. His decision could never have been arrived at by a detached scrutiny of the evidence, but in fact he finds only a religious framework is now adequate for interpreting the momentous truths he now feels exposed to. He begins to pray, says Tolstoy, not just with his lips. He believes. And I think one of the implicit points being made is that his conversion is not just a matter of accepting the proposition that God exists. Actually, it's very hard to see how just that could have any moral or spiritual significance just on its own. Rather, conversion involves a moral transformation, a transformation of the relatively confident, self-sufficient individual that Levin had been to someone who acknowledges his dependency, his vulnerability. And this, of course, is very consistent with the assumptions of classical theism in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, that what God requires is not intellectual assent, but metanoia, as it's called in Greek, change of heart, repentance, deepening of moral sensibility. And in those processes, the emotions are essentially involved. It's not just a blind, irrational process. In fact, it's interesting, Tolstoy goes on to describe how Levin continues later in the novel to wrestle with the issues intellectually, but he finds that his newfound faith is actually consolidated. Why? Because he can't in integrity deny that the insights he arrived at the moment of emotional crisis were false. So a complex amalgam of new perceptions and feelings has, says Tolstoy, entered into him through suffering and lodged itself in his soul. That's the sort of passage I would like philosophers of religion, or at least some philosophers of religion, to take more account of. The world starts to undergo a shift. This is the key to it. Wittgenstein once observed that life can educate you to a belief in God. And it's not surprising that the sort of emotional changes Tolstoy describes can affect changes that pure reason was powerless to do. In some ways, perhaps analogous to what happens in a psychotherapeutic context. If any of you are sympathetic to that example, what happens is that the lowering of the defenses of the intellect allows space for the defenses of the defenses of the intellect to be dropped, and that allows space for healing and growth, moral growth. Wittgenstein himself never managed to make the shift to religious belief, but he did comment, I'll leave you with this quotation, in a manuscript of 1937, that if you were to make the shift, the edifice of your pride has first to be dismantled, and that means frightful work, furchtbare Arbeit. So the dismantling of pride is a task in which both reason and the emotions are involved. Or perhaps we should simply say that the old opposition between reason and the emotions no longer applies, for the whole person is reshaped and renewed.